Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. Today, we're here to talk about the fantasy MMORPG, going off of our last discussion where I had talked about my idea for the hub and all that good jazz about the game. I'm not going to go into all the specifics of what I talked about last time on the last video. This one, we're just going to be focusing on a fantasy MMORPG because I love MMOs, but most are trash. Alright, so moving into it. Basic information we have. So this is going to be, you're going to buy the game for, however much, $59.99, whatever you want to do. And then you get a free month of the game that comes with it. After the free month, you pay each month. This will cut down on, the bots that you see in every game doing that real money trading nonsense. It'll provide a stable income for the future development of the game as well, and allow you to do all that stuff. Ideally, it'd be cool to have it be a full dive VR. Of course, the technology doesn't exist, so this also works as just a normal MMORPG that you can just do. It'll be a typical fantasy setting of swords and magic, medieval, all that good stuff. Whatever. Also, it'll have some unique systems and items, which I will get into, and I think is a great, thing to have, right? It's kind of cool. But anyway, moving on, let's talk about the world itself. Now, I titled this one World Lore, but we're not going to be doing too much of going into what is going on in terms of story. This is more like just broadly as a whole what is happening. So I'm thinking 3+ factions for PvP reasons. Need at least 2 so they can kind of fight and have a reason to fight, right? But out of all the MMOs I've played, the one that's really kind of stood out for multiple factions and PvP reasons for fighting has been World of Warcraft, right? Because you have 2 factions that are separated by races. So the races are locked to a specific faction, right? Which means that they cannot be on the same faction, right? So you have undead and orcs, all that stuff on one faction in World of Warcraft. Then you have the other ones being humans and dwarves all together there, right? That makes sense, because then they have a reason to fight, because they're different, right? They're not just an amalgamation of people who are, for whatever reason divided by the simple fact that they are in different places of the world, right? It gives it more of a reason of why they're fighting. So the reason I say 3+ factions is because, yeah, I want the 2 main factions, but I also want a 3rd faction that has all races be allowed to be in it. But there's a trade-off for that. That'll get into here when we actually start talking more about the races here. There'll be a trade-off to where, because all the races can be part of this group, they're going to have some negatives. But I think having a group where all the races can join and be together is nice for friends who, say, would want to play an undead and another one wants to play a human, right? That way they can all be together, which I can understand. That's probably why most games do not have the faction-locked races anymore. They're all just, be whatever you want, but that just kind of gets boring. Also, if there's not really a war with another faction, the PvP just doesn't make any sense, right? Anyway, but the idea here is that the world is at war. Not just each faction fighting each other, but there's wild monsters and such that are causing chaos. So of course you have the 2 or 3 multiple factions that are warring with each other, and all that. We're going to get into that war stuff a little bit later, because I think it's really nice how I have it planned out. But there's also, just wild monsters you get, just slimes or Hydra and stuff like that, dragons that are just all around there, causing chaos and stuff. But also, perhaps there's a overarching evil faction of wild monsters, some bad guys that are controlling them, like a demon lord, you could say. But whatever. There's also political changes that would change how the game is played, which we'll also get into at a certain time. Player-built settlements is one thing that is cool in theory, and I've seen some MMOs be yeah, so we're gonna have just player-built settlements that are gonna exist, and You know, there's going to be like one major town in the world, and then the rest of the settlements are all player builds. But the problem with that is it feels like sometimes you get left out with current ones because either you're not part of a guild that's big enough to have a player built settlement, or when you do build your settlement, you have to then protect it against PvPers, and if you don't want a PvP, it becomes a huge hassle, right? It's a whole thing. Another thing that's annoying to me with current MMOs and stuff like that is the player's the chosen one. They're like the unique one person who is amazing and godlike, and that's why they're here, right? Like Final Fantasy XIV, where you're what is it, the Warrior of Light? Is that what they're called? And other stuff like that. And then there's other ones too, where like, you have awakened the mysterious power of blah blah blah, and now you're a god amongst people, and you can destroy everything. But then there's like, excuse me. But then there's like 80,000 of you around who are all doing the same thing. Like, we're all warriors of light nonsense, and it's like, it really takes away from that uniqueness. But what I think World of Warcraft did well, at least for me when I was playing as a Forsaken, you're just a normal soldier, just a normal guy, or a normal adventurer, and you just kind of build your way up through the ranks, right? Like with the Forsaken, you start off by being just like a random troop sent off to fight in the war, right? And then as the story progresses, you like get to become like a central figure in the plot because you've done a lot as the main character, right? Which makes sense, you know? You're working your way up to it. You're not just given this amazing ability that everyone else who's a player is given, right? I think that's cool. Anyway, that's all for the world lore, the basic gist of that. Next, we're going to go into the changing world layout, which I think is very important. It's important to have a world that changes, you know? If you have a world that's just the same all the time, players are going to get bored, right? So, to do that, we have a real-time war that's going on between all the factions. I mentioned 3 factions, right? So think of it like a circular city separated with like a Y. And where the Y is happening, where the 2 factions meet each other, there's a front line happening, right? And so there's all these NPCs that are fighting. Real players can get in there and fight as well. If the players don't participate, the NPCs are basically just at like a stalemate, excuse me. Or there's various factors that can give one an advantage, like trade routes and resources and stuff like that, which I'll get into a little bit later. But front lines can basically take over other factions' towns and resources. It can move from one place to another, all that good jazz, right? So you can go out there. Let's say you want to dedicate 30 minutes per day to fighting in the frontline war. You can go out there murdering players, NPCs, and then there's like stuff behind the scenes, which is like figuring out how many players and NPCs have died that particular day. And if it reaches a certain threshold or tips in one direction too far, then the front line will change, and it'll get closer to the failing side's territory, right? Kind of like that. But the war will also cause visual changes. So think of day 1, the game starts. There's a line in the middle where a battlefield is happening. The battlefield is, muddy and dirty and all that kind of stuff because, the soldiers tromping around on it, or trebuchets going around, magic being cast, cannons going off, all that kind of stuff. But on the other sides, away from the fighting, it's lush and plentiful. There's trees, grass, animals and all that stuff. But if the front line gets pushed, very slowly the area will start turning into a wasteland, just like the original front line was, right? It'll destroy the environment. And let's say, after getting pushed back, that faction goes back to the original front line's position. Maybe they even push into the enemy territory again. Slowly, over the course of a week or a month, or however long you want to set it in game, or in real time, I should say, it'll revert back to its plentiful state. Grass will begin to grow, trees will start growing back, animals will start coming back there, and all that good jazz, right? Just kind of stuff like that to make it kind of dynamic system, right? Players can also build unique and interesting locations and structures to access new locations or to unlock faster travel. So one example of this is, let's say you have a huge lake in the middle of an area, right? You can spend like 30 minutes walking around the lake to get from point A to point B. Or if the players there pitch in enough resources like lumber, stone, gold, all that kind of stuff, it will create a dockyard at both points across the lake. And then you can just take a ship that'll take 5 minutes to get there instead, for example, right? Or just like a fast travel point, something like that, right? From A to B real quick. Be interesting, right? Stuff like that, but also perhaps there's like a mountain that you're tunneling through. And if you help get, tunnel through it, give them supplies like explosives or stuff like that for them to go through, it'll unlock a whole new area on the other side of the mountain that was inaccessible before. Stuff like that allows the player to, the player base, not only to do something interesting and discover a new land, but be a part of that thing that happens, that does get created, right? Just the things that would make the player an easier time, right? And perhaps even the war could have an effect into this. Let's say they build a dockyard in one faction territory, and as the war gets near the dockyard gets destroyed, and they'll have to rebuild the dockyard if they want to use it again on either side of the faction, right? Kind of stuff like that. But moving on, let's talk about the economy a little bit here, shall we? So, the way I envision it, that the world's NPCs will sell basic, generic items, but it's all things that if players contribute to, they'll be able to sell better things. But the best players, or the best items, are going to be made by players, and you can have things like a shop. Like if you're a player, you can like have a store where you can sell things and hire NPCs to sell the items for you, so you don't have to be there physically selling them, right? However, the best items that are made by players can also only be repaired by those skilled players, kind of like a trade-off there, right? And I don't like the idea of auction houses, or like the things where that you can be like, I'm gonna buy this from anywhere. Like you just throw up like a piece of equipment onto the auction house, and then someone buys it. First of all, there's always different prices for stuff, and it kind of removes the social interaction there. Whereas having player-driven quest boards and putting out requests for other players to gather materials for you as a crafter, for example, would be amazing, right? Let's say you're a crafter and you have someone who wants you to make like an iron sword, but you're out of iron. Well, you can go to the quest board, throw up a request for a certain amount of iron, and then another player comes by and is like, oh, I can get some money this way. I'm going to go and take that quest, get some iron, turn it in. Stuff like that, right? Yeah, I think that would be very cool. And also, you wouldn't be able to get, equipment, so knowing crafters would be a very important thing to do. Because you couldn't just be like, I don't care who made this armor, I just want to buy it off the auction house. You'll be like, okay, I've heard that so-and-so is a very skilled crafter. They can make very good stuff, a lot of nice stuff with it. I'm going to go to them, see if they're open. And it'd be kind of like how in the real world artists take commissions. Basically, you would like queue up to have this crafter create you armor, right? It'd be kind of an interesting thing, and make crafters, who in most games tend to die off towards the end game because there's no one who is like using crafted gear when you can get the best gear from dungeons and quests and stuff like that. So it allows them to have like a purpose, right? Also, I think it's very, very important to have no way to easily convert real money into in-game currency. Now, obviously, you're always going to have sometimes those guild traders who are like, yeah, if you very sketchily be like, yeah, if you just send me like $10 via PayPal, I'll give you $100 in game. But what I'm talking about specifically is being able to buy things off like a marketplace and then sell it in the game in order to get it right. So the things you can buy with real money in the game, like clothing, for example, it's just cosmetic and it cannot be traded between players. So it's just locked to your account. And any items that you buy with real money don't give you advantages. So, for example, you can't buy a potion that levels you up to max level, or you can't buy a mount that is slightly faster than everyone else's mount, right? Because that's just an unfair advantage. You want people to play the game and enjoy it, have like kind of an equal opportunity, so right? Anyway, moving on, we're going to continue on with the economy a bit here. So, players can gather materials such as woods, ores, herbs, and such, turn them into NPC towns and military groups to help build the world. So the more that you are contributing to the military, the stronger the NPCs on the front lines would be. Remember previously I mentioned during the war front line that there are things that can affect how strong the NPCs are. Otherwise, if nothing's happening, they're just at a stalemate, right? Well, if you contribute like supplies and armaments to the military, those NPCs on the front lines will have, a little bit of an edge on their enemy, right? They'll be able to push them back. There's also, if you give items to towns and stuff, the NPCs will have better items and them in stock. NPCs can run out of stock, by the way, but they'll refresh their stock daily, assuming they have materials to do so. So let's say you have a NPC that is selling potions, right? Now keep in mind, players make the best potions, but NPCs are selling just basic, cheap, easy to get potions for like noobs. So, if you do not give them anything, not give the town any herbs, for example, the NPCs won't be able to refresh their stock because they have no supplies to make potions with. Or even if they don't get any, you could still have it be like, okay, they only have like 5 potions in stock for this. What like other NPCs world delivering to them, right? Stuff like that. But if you give them really high grade herbs and give them a lot of them, they'll be able to increase their stock, increase what they're giving you, and stuff like that, right? So basically, it's both towns and the military require a constant flow of goods, and if they don't get them, they'll revert to the previous tiers. So if you, let's say, give the military like 50 swords for a week, right? That'll increase the NPC's strength, but then the next week, you don't give them anything, they'll get weaker over time because their swords are getting used up and dulled, basically, right? Same with the towns. If you start giving the NPCs a bunch of herbs to make potions with, and then suddenly stop, they'll get less quality potions and less potions in general, right? But also, there's also just like basic town upkeep that you could do, say for like town walls or something. And if you don't contribute enough certain material, things start to look degraded, less good. You could even have them providing soap. You could provide soap for the area. And if soap is not delivered to the town, it starts looking a little bit dirtier. There's little piles of dirt on the sides of the road that's creeping up, right? You could do like anything with that, right? Just to make it so it feels like you're creating some sort of impact in the world, what I think is important to do with an MMO, right? Because usually when you're playing an MMO, you're just a guy who's just going through quests and doing stuff. But in the things that I want to do, you're a person who's contributing to something that actually changes how the game is played or looks or something like that, right? I think that's very important to have. Next, moving on, we're going to talk about the races. So you can have basic humanoid races, things like humans, elves, beastmen, dwarves, maybe angel or devil races have wings and they can like fly a little bit off the ground, whatever. Then you have monster races like golems, naga, lamia, lizardmen, undead, skeletons, zombies, goblins, whatever you want to do. Right? But then you can also just make unique races, right? Not everything has to look like a humanoid, right? So you could have like a chimera race that's made up of like a mashup between different races. Think of like an undead Frankenstein, right? You could take a lamia's lower body, a golem's upper body, and partially cover the Lamia's tail in rock of the golem body, right? And then get like a human head that has like some rockiness to it as well. It's kind of stuff like that. That one might be a little more complicated, but a little bit easier to implement would be a small race called pairs. I'm just going to call them pairs. They could be named whatever. That is bonded in pairs. And they basically need to hold hands to survive. And the player controls both pairs, and they can customize them both. They can let go of their hands, so they don't have to hold their hands. But if they do for too long or go too far away from each other, they'll lose their like bonded state and become catatonic or die if it's for too long, right? I think that's kind of an interesting thing. I got this idea from anyone remembers the Teen Titan episodes where there's that pair of guys who I think they're like magnet kind of guys. They have like a plus and minus one, and they hold hands to like run really fast. That's kind of the idea, but you know, stuff like that. So the player would be controlling both of the characters, but it's technically one character because they're holding hands the whole time, really. And let's say you have them dual wielding swords. They'd be holding hands in the middle, and then each one would have like a sword in their other hand and be fighting like that and like throwing each other around to do interesting attacks, right? I think that would be kind of interesting, right? Just stuff like that. Then also, why not add just weird, out of left field races that are just randomly cute, like a plushie race, for example, that are just magically animated plushies, like a teddy bear or a bunny or something. They're just really small plushies that look really cute, but they're sentient and you can control. Interesting. Continuing on, you can separate the races into factions that make sense, like all humanoids versus all the monsters, stuff like that. So going back to here, you'd have all the basic humanoids versus the monsters, and then like for the races, the pairs could go into the humanoid side, the chimera and plushies could go into the monster race, or the plushies could have, you know, maybe integrated into the humanoid side, whatever. But each race has their ups and downs, right? As they always usually do. So like angels could fly a little bit off the ground, but because of their lightweight bodies, they're physically weaker. Plushies would, of course, have low defense, since they're made of fabric and cotton, basically. But they're better at sneaking around and assassination or magic because, well, they don't have a huge weight to them, right? So they could sneak around easily because they're just soft little feet, stuff like that. Golems, they'd be physically strong but have lower magical abilities since they don't really have any like organs or like flow for like magical stuff, right? Naga and Lamia, they wouldn't be able to wear legs or foot armor because they have, you know, like a snake-like body beneath them. But they'd be able to move quickly in any direction. You know, usually how when you like walk backwards, you're a little bit slower than you can run forward. But they don't have that problem because they can just go backwards. Even the Beastman race could be like subdivided into sub-races, right? Such as like bunnies being able to jump higher, cats being quicker, but then they're weaker. But then you also have the bear beastmen, which are like stronger, but they're also a little slower, right? Kind of like trade-offs. You do whatever you want to do. You don't have to have the same generic, here's a human, here's an elf. The elf is better at magic. And then here's a dwarf. The dwarf is better at physical stuff, but worse at magic. Humans are good all-arounders, right? You could have them do interesting stuff like this. Like different races that aren't the generic ones that every single MMO uses, right? Now the factions. The main factions are going to be similar, obviously, but they're going to have different architecture depending upon the races. So monster races would have maybe a more sinister look to them, whereas the humanoid races would have like a more cleaner, normal look, right? But not only that, each race would have its own capital city that looks unique for them. Maybe but there's also like a main faction capital. So there's a faction capital, and then there's the race capitals, right? So, like for example, maybe the plushies have a capital in which they have areas that are too small for the other races to enter, where only they can enter into, right? So there's kind of like this unique space just for plushie players because they're really small, right? Or maybe the golem race, for example, has certain areas that can only be accessed by them because they have high resistance to heat, so they can go into like molten volcanic areas and chill, right? But all race Basically, here's where I was mentioning like the all race. Every single race would have like its drawbacks, right? If you have a faction that has all races, so it only has a capital city. It doesn't have other major cities. However, as a player, you could still technically go to your race's home city and be fine because you're of that race. But any other race is gonna like say, no, get the hell out of here. You're part of that faction, right? Um, but the all race faction also has worse gear available from NPCs. NPC soldiers are also going to be weaker, just basically due to them having less teamwork. They're also going to have fewer resources because they have less land, because all of them are kind of together, right? Um, so you know, there's sort of those drawbacks there. There could be other drawbacks too, just things that we know make sense. Because like, if you think about it, the all race faction is like a faction of betrayers. They betrayed their other factions to form a third one and are going against both factions. They're going against their own people, right? Kind of interesting. We then get to faction elections, which is the politics kind of thing I was talking about. So the way I imagine this is each faction and city will have elections where one guild will be nominated as the head guild for a month or so. So players can vote for the guilds that apply to be candidates. So let's say you have 5 guilds that are like, yeah, we want to be the owner of this city for a month, basically, right? You can't apply for multiple cities at a time. You can only be a candidate for one city at one time. And then after you've been elected and have been in charge of a city, there's a cooldown period where you can't be a candidate in the next election for any city for like a certain amount of time. So let's say you get elected to be the faction leader of the main city. And then after that, you have like a cooldown period of 3 months before you can be a candidate for any other city, right? And the key thing here is players cannot vote for their own guild, so that large guilds don't always win. So it's more of a like communal, like, hey, vote for us. We'll do this, this, and this. We'll make things more interesting. We'll hold events. Like, this is where it comes into play of being more of a social game rather than our guild has the most players because we're going to vote for ourselves. We're always going to have this city, and you all can get bent. That's why there's also that rotational like cooldown period between someone owning a city and whatnot there, right? But what can the faction leaders do? Well, I'm glad you asked. They'll be able to decide where to focus attacks on the front lines. They'll be able to decide some vendor prices, and they'll be able to decide on hosting events. Now, this is specifically for the faction leaders, the deciding where NPCs attack. That's specifically the ones who are in charge of like the faction HQ city, not the individual race city, right? When I say events, what I'm talking about is each faction has these like basic and unique events which they can hold by spending some money. The leaders get a set amount of gold to start with. So when they win the election, they're given like 30,000 gold, for example, right? And you can get more gold from vendor NPCs, right? Whenever a vendor NPC makes a sale, you get a portion of that as tax money, right? So that's why you can say, yeah, we're going to raise NPC prices, but then players won't necessarily buy anything from them, which means you won't get any income. Or you can lower the prices, players would buy more, but they would also give you less in taxes, right? So it's kind of that trade-off. But focus on this one. So with the events, I'm thinking of things like, depending upon what time of year it is in real life, you could have like Halloween events that you queue up, and each one of them would cost a certain amount of gold, right? So let's say if you wanted to host a Halloween event, which would overhaul how the city looks to make it more Halloween themed, and would have like Halloween NPC quests and stuff like that in that city, you would pay 5,000 gold, right? And it would last for a set duration, let's say 1 week. And then after that happens, you could also run another event, such as, I mean, you could do like an event to do anything really. You could have a parade go through there. It would be something that the developers would have to have already coded in, right? The people wouldn't be able to just decide anything. Otherwise, it would just be a normal event, right? But if the developers have created it in there, they can do it. So you could have like a parade event. You could have an event where there's like a festival going on with mini games and stuff like that. You could have a festival where there's like a huge prayer to a god or a goddess or something, and anyone who comes into the city, approaches the statue in the middle and prays to it, gets a temporary buff that lasts a certain amount of time, right? And that's like the only way to get that buff ever is to do that. Could make it so vendors give a 2-for-1 pricing, right? So you still get the vendor money, but the players get 2 items instead of 1 or something, you know? Kind of whatever you wanted to do, right? There is more that I'll touch on a little bit later about events, but for now, that's kind of all that I'm thinking about here. So there's faction wars in the PvP. So the front lines where the war is going on is going to be just an open PvP zone. If you enter it, you're flagged for PvP, even if you don't want a PvP, for anyone who enters in. PvP won't be allowed anywhere else other than like in arenas, or if there's like specific instanced PvP areas. Like, you know how World of Warcraft has the, like you queue up for an instance of like the capture the flag type games, right? Stuff like that. Those kind of areas. But the front lines, like I've mentioned previously, would either be in open fields between cities or in towns and cities. So you could have, you know, one day the battle's in a field, the next day it's right at the race capital of the plushies, right? And you're fighting inside the city walls, pushing back the enemy soldiers, and all that kind of stuff in order to try to save the town, right? But the faction and race capitals can be taken over if the front line does reach them, which is a very key thing. So the towns and cities taken over will not sell to the previous faction owners anymore. So let's say if faction A takes over faction B's city, faction B's city will no longer sell to faction B because faction A owns it again, right? So the conquering people will be the only ones who can like buy from the NPCs there, and also the conquering faction's guards will replace the losing faction's guards. So they'll attack anyone who tries to get in from the opposing faction. And then, of course, small note here, any player who has logged out in a city that has been conquered will be given a choice of what city they would like to be moved to next when they log in. That way you just have, that way you don't have an issue where, like I logged out for like a week, the city I was logged out in got conquered, I log back in, all of a sudden I'm in hostile territory and I just get instantly killed and murdered, right? As a side note to all the PvP here, I think it's very important that you have a definition of like whether or not you lose gear when you're fighting, or if you lose anything when you're fighting in PvP. Personally, I don't like when you lose stuff when you PvP, right? I think it's annoying. It increases the risks and the rewards, sure, but it also just makes people angry, and sometimes they'll just quit the game if they died with their best stuff, right? So you could have like multiple servers, one for like a hardcore PvP where you lose everything if you die, and then another one where if you die you just take everything back to like the spawn point, right? Stuff like that. Moving on from here though, continuing on our faction war in PvP, we're going to talk about the captured cities. What happens when you capture a city? Well, I'm glad you asked. So, the faction and race capitals can be conquered by the enemy. This we have stated before. So, when a faction capital is taken, the new capital becomes something like a hidden cave, something that can't be taken. So, if faction A conquers all of faction B's land, faction B, they're then based in this like hidden cave where they can launch raids from. It's kind of like their temporary capital city. This allows that faction to continue trying to fight while also having a safe place to do so. It's not like they're completely wiped off the map and everything is hostile to them. They still have, you know, an area that they can't, you know, go past. And then if they want to, first step in fighting back is to retake their capital city. If they manage to do that, and then their hidden cave capital goes away. and they can continue going from the main capital again, right? Moving on, recently captured cities will have their defenses damaged, crumbling walls and stuff like that. Because obviously, if you're taking over a city, you're gonna probably destroy its gates or walls, maybe even its defenses of trebuchets, catapults, ballista, stuff like that. So that stuff will be destroyed when you take it over. And the guilds in charge of the conquered cities, they can do various things. Because the conquering cities, or the conquered cities, will become part of that conquering faction. So the conquering faction can hold elections to have a guild run that conquered city, right? So the guild in charge of the conquered city can do things like oppressing citizens and getting more money out of them, or events. And the events, unlike in the normal like cities, they're not all going to be happy, right? Like you could hold events to execute rebels, to make the population unhappy, or you could brainwash civilians to make it seem like you're doing them a favor and that the people you beat were horrible people, right? Stuff like that. They can also spend money to repair the defenses and make it harder for it to be taken back by the enemy. So you can repair like the crumbling walls or defenses and stuff like that. So obviously, if you don't do that, then the enemy's just going to walk back in through the hole that you made and all that good stuff, right? But yeah, so the guilds in charge of these conquered cities will lose access to it if it is liberated. So let's say you got elected as leader for a month, and then it gets liberated like a week later, you just lose access. But at any time during your occupation, you can make an event that smuggles out the remaining money of that city. So let's say you get elected, you're given that 30,000 gold, you can host an event which will take like 50% of the gold, and you can smuggle it out. However, that money that you smuggled out doesn't go to you and your guild. It instead goes to the faction city's money pool. Whoever's currently in charge of the faction city would be the people getting that, because that makes sense, right? Because you're not going to be able to get money like that. That doesn't make sense. Right? But if you do smuggle money out, you won't be able to hold, earn any more money or hold any more events. So that's something you want to maybe do only if you're really threatened by beating, right? Moving on to liberated cities. So factions can liberate their previously captured cities. They'll regain control and have the ability to hold elections again. After liberation, the first month will have limited functions for leading the guild, or the leading guild. So if the occupiers smuggled money out, you're going to start with no money to use because they took all the money. And the only way that you can host events is by relying on NPC revenue. If the occupiers brainwashed the residents, however, all NPC income will be halved for that first month that the city is taken back. If the occupiers mistreated the residents, doing things like executions and other stuff like that, you'll need to host events that needed to be done in order to correct whatever they did to mistreat them, right? So if they like held an event to like beat the citizens of the city or something, you would need to provide them with medical care before you could like rebuild the walls, stuff like that, or hold like a festival, anything like that, right? However, just like the occupiers, they will also have events to rebuild the defenses if the defenses were destroyed, stuff like that. And of course, the faction guards swap again. Same with the NPCs, who sell to who, all that good. All that stuff kind of slips around, right? A lot more than just we own this now, get over it. It's different things. Like you can sabotage someone who's taking over your city, or who's like, if you're losing after you conquered the city, you can be like, screw you, I'm going to brainwash your residents so your income will be halved, so you can't rebuild defenses right away. I'm going to smuggle out the money so that way we'll have an easier time trying to take it back here in this next month, right? Stuff like that. Now let's move on to player settlements. So players can get together to create a settlement in open areas, obviously. Where else would you create them, right? So it doesn't necessarily have to be like a guild. It can be any group of individuals, let's say like 20, just, right? So you could have 5 people from this guild and 5 people from that guild, and then 10 people who are just random, not associated with any guilds. You could have them all get together. They would all join a settlement guild, we could call it, whatever. And then they can all contribute to settlement funds and resources in order to build a settlement. Just like a city, just on a smaller scale, there will be elections held monthly in the cities or in the settlements, and they'll elect 5 people to represent the interests of the settlement, right? Think of it kind of like village elders, right? So these 5 will vote on what they want to do to build and expand the city. They can do things like choosing what kind of NPC shops are in the town, for example. Like maybe they want to be like, this NPC is going to sell potions, or this one's they're going to sell lumber, or whatever, right? They can also do things like focusing on ore refinery or converting wood to lumber, stuff like that. You can do that. Think of it like having a tech tree. Like you can select certain things that you want to do with the city, but if you choose one path, the other path gets closed off, right? So you can't have like an ore refinery and a lumber mill in the same city. Right? The settlements also get bonuses based upon the locations they were chosen. For example, if you have a settlement near wood, it can produce woods. If you have a settlement near mountains, you can create a mine to harvest gems and ores. If it's on the plains, you can create farms to do crops and herbs. Or if it's on the ocean, you can get fish. That. Moving on, we have material gathering. So gatherers not only gather, but also replenish, right? Otherwise, I don't like how some games just have it be like, oh yeah, so you harvest this material and then it's gonna respawn in like 20 minutes, right? What I think that we should do, have a system with like trees and herbs, stuff like that. When you cut something down, you can replant it. The system will limit how many things you can remove before replanting. So let's say you harvest 10 herbs and don't replant any. You then just can't harvest anything anymore until you've replanted some herbs. Doesn't matter how much time passes. Doesn't matter how much, other stuff you do. You need to go back and replant some herbs. But the replanting or whatever, it doesn't really do much. It just speeds up the respawn time of the materials. So obviously you don't want to have it, or maybe you do want to have it. Maybe you could, where you have like a huge patch of herbs, right? And you harvest all of them. No one replants because they're like, I'm just going to be a troll and make it so my settlement is the only place that you can get these herbs from, right? So you can't replant there. But they'll still respawn after a while. So let's say like 3 days they'll come back, right? But if you replant, they'll be back in like 30 minutes, stuff like that. Additionally, materials like ores, they can't really be replenished, right? So you're going to have to dig new mines. So the way I envision mining is once you have a mine tapped out of all resources, everything is gone. The gatherers have to go and survey a new mine in the area and collapse the old mine. After time, the old mine, which is now inaccessible, it's just like a pile of dirt that looks like a bunch of rocks thrown together, right? It'll disappear back into the ground and just be a normal plain or something, right? But then, the surveyed new mine, they'll contribute some resources into it, some wood planks to make the entrance, right? And then it'll have the entrance, and you have to go in and start digging by hand. Think of it like Minecraft, where, there's a bunch of stone, but inside the stone, there's like iron ore and other ores like that, right? And you can sometimes hit like an ore vein that'll have like a huge area where you can just start mining away at it, right? So the new mines, they're like randomly generated, and it has like walls you can't mine through. Think of like Minecraft bedrock, right? So if you go straight for like a while, you might eventually hit that bedrock. But then in certain areas, you can like turn left and right and keep going through the stone, get to the ore, right? But then there's like also going to be like a mine foreman NPC, which will tell you how much of the ore is left in the mine. That way you can tell like, oh yeah, there's like 5% ore left in this mine, like that, right? Whatever. And then the stones that you get from the mines, you can use to give it to the factions and militaries for use. You could also give it to crafters who are crafting like stone furniture or stuff like that, or to settlements who are using housing, whatever. Stuff like that, right? But, yeah. I think that's a much better take on than, here's like a node of ore that like disappears and reappears every time, and no matter how much you take from it, it doesn't like appear or anything. And for the ore one specifically, think of like having 5 separate areas in the world that you can get iron ore at, but only one of them can be active at a time, right? Like you have a mine in this one location, and then when you tap that one out, randomly one of the other locations will be chosen as one that has the iron now, or I guess all of them do, but you can only go activate one or whatever. So you do that, and then that's the new iron mine, right? Something like that. Moving on to crafting. Whew, man. So I believe crafters should rely on gatherers, right? NPCs shouldn't sell raw materials like herbs and stuff. So crafters should want to use the quest board to issue requests for them. You know, like they should be like, yeah, I need 5 iron ore, go mine it for me. That kind of stuff. They should also utilize a basic tech tree to progress, I think. Like you can spend skill points in order to level up. Those skill points would be earned from normal character level ups, but also after you make certain crafting milestones, you would get crafting skill points, right? But they'll be like just basic tech tiers, like copper or iron or steel for like weapon related stuff, right? It wouldn't be like steel pickaxe or steel sword or stuff like that, right? Because I believe crafters should have the freedom to do things and figure things out, right? So unlocking a tier, like let's say you unlock the copper tier, you shouldn't then just be given a bunch of copper recipes for like a pickaxe and stuff like that, right? You should have to like discover them through trial and error by mixing random herbs and ingredients together. That once created, a recipe can be stored and then easily reproduced. So with things like pickaxes and weapons and armor, it's a little bit harder to envision. But imagine like a alchemist, right? So you have like these 5 herbs. You don't know what they're gonna make. You just have basic descriptions about what they do. So you combine 2 of them together, and you don't know what it's gonna make. Like, oh, this is a health potion. Cool. So after you've done that once, you then unlock the health potion recipe, and you can then just start creating it over and over again without having to select the individual herbs. As long as you have them in your inventory, you can do it. Think of it like Skyrim or like the Elder Scrolls, how you don't really know what an ingredient does right away until you like eat it or have a certain level of alchemy skill. And even then you have to like figure out what ingredients go together to make certain potions, right? Think of it like that. Additionally, armor and weapon crafting should allow for customization, choosing from different materials, trims, and stuff like that. Like if you make a steel sword, you should be able to choose like what kind of sword. Like if it wants to be a normal straight sword, maybe you want to make a flamberg. Do you want to maybe have a flamberg with a copper crossguard on it and with like a gold hilt handle kind of thing, right? It does mix and match kind of different stuff around. And then going into player continued, player made items can only be repaired by players, right? So that means like iron tier items can only be repaired by a player with the iron tier skill, right? It doesn't mean that, oh, I'm just a player, I can repair this. It means they had to have invested time into the game. So if you have an iron sword and you take it to a blacksmith who only knows copper, they're like, can't repair it. Sorry, man, go find an ironsmith, right? So sort of makes the crafters more important than they are in normal games because anyone can just grab something and repair their dang weapon, right? But you'll actually need crafters to do it in this one, right? And I think like whenever possible, previous items should be used to create better ones. So think of like creating a weak health potion and using it to create a stronger potion of the same thing. This way you aren't just like having items that are a stepping stone to the next one where like in Skyrim you make 1,000 iron daggers and then just immediately go make dragon armor, something like that, right? You can also have it be so like a new alchemist would create a weak health potion and then sell them to an advanced alchemist who has already leveled up their stuff and can make a stronger potion using the weaker potion made by a new alchemist, right? But in addition to what we were talking about back here about the armor and weapons, right? I think crafters should be able to name their crafted goods and have their name displayed, right? It seems pretty standard for the most part. Maybe not the naming the goods, but having their name like crafted by so and so is usually a pretty stable thing when it comes to armor and weapons. But especially if you have the stuff that's like, this is steel armor that's gilded in gold trim, overlaid with mithril, like sculpting stuff, right? Whatever. I think it would be cool to, this is the stuff that I made. I'm amazing. Decorative gear and so cool, right? And be like, hey, who made your gear? And it's like, oh yeah, this I'm wearing, so and so, top tier blacksmith at so and so guild, right? Whatever. Next on, let's talk about unique items and equipment, what I call sentient arms, for a reason I'll get into in a moment. So I think we should have unique items that require a lot of work to obtain. Think of like going through a quest that has 50 different like quest markers in order to get a certain item. But it's not just that, you have to also do like puzzles, or you have to go to certain weird locations at certain times, stuff like that. However, only one player at a time can own the item per server. Like if you have 2 servers, there's only 2 of these items that ever exist, right? But they can never exist in the same server. And also, to make it a little more fair, I think that if the player has not played for a month, or if their subscription expires, the item should be removed from them, but someone else has the chance to obtain it. Players can also surrender an item to allow someone else to obtain it, but these unique items cannot be traded or sold or anything like that. This is why they're called sentient arms for the last 2 reasons here, because they kind of pick their owner, right? Because you can't trade it because it won't allow you to, and if you have abandoned the game and thus abandoned the equipment, it will remove itself from your service and find someone else more worthy, right? So basically, every time a player loses one of them, either from inactivity or surrendering it, the method of obtaining the item should change. So each item should have a few ways to get it, but only one at a time, right? That way it feels unique every time, and you're not like, oh, hey, the guy who owns the bow of godliness, he hasn't played in a month. I'm going to do the same exact quest that he posted about and get the bow immediately, right? You'll have to kind of figure out how to get it. And players can only have one unique at a time. So if you get like a ring of like shielding that protects you for like one would-be death hit, for example, you can't also get a sword of damaging health. Even if you go through all the process that would have unlocked it, you just won't be able to trip any of the flags while you have a unique bounty or account, right? Let's say one item you need to like kill 30 rabbits for, but you already own a unique. So if you kill 30 rabbits, nothing happens for you because you already have one. But yeah, I think with these it's really cool because it encourages people to explore the world and just try weird stuff. And what's really important here is that you don't tell anyone these exist, or how many there are, or the method to getting them. You just let players try random things until the first unique gets found. And people are like, what? There's unique items? And then this starts this like thing that happens, right? And it doesn't even have to be like a quest chain to do it, right? It could be some very vague, weird stuff. Like, let's say that there is a holy sword in a stone somewhere, right? But it only likes people who are righteous. And scattered throughout the world, there are all of these NPCs that have really tedious, stupid tasks, like find my missing cat, or go to the grocery store and pick up some food for me, or walk me across the street, stuff like that. That's just, why would you want to do that quest? But if you do all of them and then go to the sword in the stone, it'll let you actually draw it, right? And then the stone is just a stone in the ground with a hole after you take it out, right? By doing that, it like encourages people to try different things, and you're never sure what's going to do it, right? because you maybe need to do this quest and this quest in order to trigger being able to actually start finding this rare item, right? So you never know what exactly you did to get it. It's always just hey, you happen to have every single flag you needed checked to do this, now you can get it, right? So it encourages people to experiment, to do everything, scour the land. Moving on, we have the cosmetic shop, also known as the real money shop, where you can buy things. So it allows players to buy in-game items with real money. Cosmetics only. So things like outfits, pets, housing decorations, weapon skin, all that good stuff. Things that don't affect the gameplay, but make you look dang good doing it, right? I think it's also really interesting and also adds content by allowing player-created content to be sold for players to earn money. So you can offer the software to create these items and then let players create them and submit them. Like they make like a 3D sword, model of a sword, right? Looks crazy. It's got like bones and spikes all over it, right? They submit it. Developers have like a team that's dedicated to go through this, review all the submissions. If it passes the submission, it gets approved. If not, you're told the player, better luck next time. We didn't like sign, or it wasn't good enough, or whatever. And then the players will receive a cut of the sale of that item that any other player buys, right? The amount of the cut would depend upon the extra work needed to be done. So for example, if you submit like a low quality like sword or something that has some flaws in it that need to be touched up in order to make it fit into the game better, you would get less money because the developers had to do extra work for it than if you were to submit like a high quality thing that the developers were able to just copy paste into the game. There you go, right? Not only is that a great way to add content to the game, but it's a great way to recruit new talent to the company as future developers, because you'll be able to like see, this guy's submitting these really great designs for clothing and costumes. Why don't we get them in here, give them a job, and they can start doing this full time for us, right? Kind of cool. And of course, the cosmetics can't be traded with other players, because if you did, that'd be some way to trade real money with players, and it's sketchy. Anyway, moving on to unique areas and experiences. Sorry, it's been like an hour and I've been talking straight, my mouth's dry. This is why I chose the hub for the first video and not this one. All right. So unique areas and experiences. I think it's important to create unique or strange areas for players to experience. These events are areas that would exist until they're found, and then they would either disappear for a while or remain, but in a less unique way. Think of it like a mystical pond that has fairies gathered around it, who will grant the player a temporary buff. But after experiencing that, the fairies will disappear, and it just becomes a normal pond for a month before it can happen again. Think of it like caverns that can only be accessed during a full moon, where if it's not a full moon, the entrance to the cavern just looks like a normal rock face and you can't get into it. Or places that can only be accessed by a player wearing a specific item. Like they go to a graveyard, there's nothing there. But they come back the next day and they have this random ring that a widow gave them, and it opens up a path into one of the graves of her dead lover or something like that. And then there's a dungeon down there or something, right? Something interesting like that. This adds... You can add unique lore or NPCs. You can meet the same NPC over and over again at that area. And, the first time you meet them, they're like cautious around you and stuff. And then you meet them a couple more times and, start to talk more about who they are and what they did, stuff like that. And you can get some lore or maybe like a special buff or something from them, right? Cool stuff like that. Even like one-time bosses, where they're like hidden secret bosses that need like a specific way to trigger them, that can be found and challenged. but after the first time they are defeated, they can still be found by the same method, but they're going to be a lot weaker than what they were. So it gives you that like satisfaction of I was the first one. I took down this amazingly difficult boss. Now everyone who came after me, they're just meager shells of what I was. Because they're fighting this boss that is just so much weaker than the one I fought, right? Stuff like that. And what sort of inspired this for me, this whole unique area thing, is going back to WoW. It was like decades ago. I was someone who would explore around a lot. And I found this, like, it was a mystical pond, I remember, I think. It was like this pond that had a glow to it, and there was like fireflies and these like, looked like they were like fairy circles around the pond or something like that. Or maybe it was just fairy circles, and it was like a circle of circles, right? And then there was like these NPCs that were like these plant things inside of them or something like that. It's been a long time, I don't remember. But I went there like one night and saw that. And then I went back there again later, another day, and it was not there. I was like, huh, like the circle on the ground and stuff was there, but the NPCs and the creatures weren't there. And I was like, that is amazing that I stumbled upon this and had that experience. Kind of make it people want to explore your world and find unique things. Moving on, let's talk about character progression. Seems like we should have talked about it earlier, but whatever. So as usual, you're going to earn experience and level up, but we're going to allow full customization of character by spending skill points into strength, dexterity, luck, etc. We're also going to make it so equipment isn't level dependent, but it's stat dependent. So just having the minimum stat doesn't necessarily mean you can use the equipment properly. So if a axe requires 5 strength, for example, you can use it, sure, but the more strength you have, the harder you will hit with it, and the faster you can swing it, right? Also, if you have like armor that requires 10 strength to wear, you can wear it and use it and fight with it, right? But if you have 15 strength instead of 10, you'll be able to move much faster. Maybe it'll drain less stamina from you as you use it. Who knows? And then, of course, no set classes. Players should be able to choose whatever skills they want and, invent their own playstyle with that, right? So there's no like, you're an assassin, here's your assassin skills. It's like, no, I want to be, an assassin that is also a healer, that also uses a bow sometimes. Maybe I even have a huge greatsword, whatever. Maybe I want to be an assassin that uses a great sword bigger than my body. Who knows? Who can say? Whatever. Next up, talk about the magic system. So we talked about character progression. Magic system sounds nice here. So the magic system I want is like unique. I want something better than just I click or I press the number 1 key and I cast Fireball after I unlock the Fireball ability from the trader. Or the spell should be made up of words, not just skills. So certain words create certain effects, like ignis, meaning fire in Latin, and pila, or whatever, in Latin, meaning ball. Combine them, you cast Fireball, right? So you have like a word for an element, a word for a shape, combine them, and it makes something, right? You can also have like a word for duration or area of effect, stuff like that happens. Even timing, you want to do, even strength. Do anything you want. And to cast magic, you have to spend skill points to unlock the words and then combine them into spells. Think of it like you're a wizard researching magic, right? And you plugging away at a book, translating stuff, and you're like, oh, this word means fire. Excellent. And then you can use the word. Well, let's say you cast a spell that's just ignis. You just have a little fire in your hand. Light campfires. Cool. Whatever. But then you get another word called ball. Like, ooh, what if I combine this with fire and make a fireball, and then you can actually throw it, hit someone, right? So you can, depending upon the words, combine them together to make spells. And depending upon what words are used, the MP cost will change, because obviously if you use like a huge area of effect word, it's going to cost more because you're going to do more damage, right? You can then save the spell you create as a skill, but you can use at any time. Some words, however, won't be able to be unlocked by just spending skill points talking to like a wizard about it. They'll have to be found in the world. So let's say you go to this old wizard tower and they have a scroll that tells you a word of lightning, for example. Found that word, you can then use it. But you can also share it with other people. So if you want to like be like, hey, I'm a holder of lightning magic, I will teach you the word of lightning, but you may use it too. You can charge them for it. Be like, yeah, I'm selling lightning for like 5 million gold, baby, yeah. Or you can be like, hey, you're in my guild, right? Here's the lightning word. Fun with it. Some spells, depending upon what words you combine, could become a grand spell. Think of like Meteor Shower, where it's like this huge spell that like destroys everything that it hits. It would cost a lot of MP to use and take a long time to cast. Think like a minute charge up time or so. But to cast a grand spell, you also have to type it in chat. You can't just press a button for it. You have to type it in chat so your character says it. Or if it's a full dive VR game, you have to say them aloud, because they're just that powerful, right? I think that's a really cool thing, right? You know, kind of cool. Moving on, skill systems. Similar to Magic, in a way. So skills can be acquired from trainers who are just in towns and cities. These NPCs specialize in a specific type of combat. Each skill costs a specific amount of skill points and money to learn them. So you go to an archer trainer and they can teach you about shooting arrows and skills like that. However, just like magic words, some skills can only be found in certain areas of the world, such as an old ruined city. You get a book and it teaches you how to slash twice in a row or something, right? Just like magic, these skills can be taught to others by free or charging them. Is that. I think it's also important to have unique skills, just like unique equipment. So they can be found through specific scenarios, just like equipment can be. If the player lets their subscription expire, doesn't play for a month, they lose the skill, and other players can find it again. Just like equipment. But it also is like unique magic words. So like I was saying, think about lightning. Like, if you find a unique skill that is lightning, you can then cast lightning. Or, for example, if someone gets like I think necromancy would be kind of a cool one. Like, find a magic word called arise, right? And you can like arise on a killed enemy, and it like creates a skeleton little guy, something like that. And that's just a unique skill. No one else can have that except for you, right? I just think that would be really neat, freaking neat. Or just not even like a magic stuff, but if you have a, let's just say dual wielding is a unique skill that only one person can use, or maybe you have a skill that's unique for scythes. The Grim Reaper's scythe throw, where you like throw the scythe that like spins before returning and you catch it again or something like that, right? Whatever. Now let's talk about expansion and new content. So new content should be getting released frequently and not all at once. Most MMOs suck, because once you do everything, you hit a wall for months or years before something new is introduced. And the only thing you can do is either PvP or grind the same dungeons over and over again for slightly better gear. Ugh. Nothing has turned me off of an MMO more than having nothing to do at endgame other than PvP. I'm not a big PvPer, so if there's no more content when I reach the end game and all I have to do is run the same dungeon 1,000 times to get gear that increases my HP by 5 more HP, it's like, why? So what I think is important is to, instead of saving up for one big expansion like World of Warcraft and stuff does, you should be constantly updating stuff. It doesn't even have to be like new land masses and stuff like that. You can save that stuff for later down the road. But I think adding like unique areas, unique skills, new stuff like that, new items, all that kind of jazz. Just so people keep paying attention, right? You add a couple new skills here and there. You add a new outfit. You add new armor. You add new unique things. You create a new town or something like that, or create new monsters that are coming out of the, whatever you want to do. Just so long as something new is happening, like maybe once a week, if not once every 2 weeks, maybe even a month. Something that will give players a little bit more time to not get burnt out on, right? And that brings me to player added content, which is the last slide. Thank God, my voice is not happy right now. Create a system that allows players to add content, right? So I don't know how many of you played this, but there's the Dungeon and Dragon MMO. It's just Dungeon and Dragon Online or something like that. But they have this dungeon creator where players can create dungeons using the prefab things the developers have made. They can put different monsters and traps and stuff like that into it, and then they can publish that dungeon, and then players can challenge the dungeon going through it. Obviously, you want to give them less experience and loot than a normal dungeon would give, because you don't want people to like abuse the system and just like run through those by placing a lot of easy to kill, high experience monsters or something around there. But I think that'd be something that you could do. You could also, if you wanted to, just like with the player cosmetic designs, release software out there and be like, hey players, if you want, design something we might add into the game. Make a new structure that we can add into the game, and we'll pay you a flat amount depending on how much work it took. Or really ambitious player, why don't you create a whole new continent and we will throw that into the game, money for it. Maybe charge people to go to that continent, and you get some money from that every time someone pays to go to that area, right? Not necessarily like they pay to go to it every time, like a toll booth, but I mean like, think of it like an expansion area, right? Like you pay $5 to unlock the area permanently, and then like the player gets that. Something like that, anything like that. These are just all my ideas. I'm sure I have more ideas for fantasy MMO than what I've listed here. I just sat down for a couple hours and wrote this out. There's still plenty more whirling inside my head that I'm like, oh, we could do this or this or this, that I probably just can't think of right now, because sometimes you just can't think of stuff, right? But yeah, all this stuff for my MMO that really fun to do, right? What do you all think? Do you think this stuff could be fun? And obviously, when I have mentioned before in the first video, some of this stuff can't be done with today's technology. Basically, all of this, even the most minimal thing, just a random MMO, is basically going to need a budget of a company to make. Because you don't really have many normal indie groups making MMOs. If you do, they're very basic and not like expansive like what I'm imagining, right? But yeah, what do y'all think? Let me know, and next time we'll talk about something else and go from there. But thank y'all for watching. Bye for now.